But real quick, since we're coming off of week 3, Justin, going into week 4, we're going to talk about some of our biggest takeaways from week 3 really quick. And I see you got a couple here in the notes, so why don't you share those with us?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway was Josh Allen finally popped off, went nuclear on everybody, and had a beastly game that brought him up to QB1.
Thank goodness I traded for him in a league. I'm so happy.
Yeah, the first 2 weeks you're like, okay, it isn't amazing, but we can get some progress going forward, and we all knew it would happen. And it was just a great game to see him ball out. So that was awesome. And I still think that he has potential to finish QB1, even though how well Kyler Murray is playing. Diggs hasn't really popped off. So once you combine those two, it should be good. I really do think that the first couple of games, they lost to Pittsburgh to start it off. He didn't have a good game. He had a quiet game against Miami. And now Washington, a fairly good defense. He just went absurd. So hopefully he keeps that going against Houston, which we all know what's going on with them. And KC coming up. So he should have 2 weeks where he just airs it out. So good for him. I wish I had him.
There were some people talking about a slump of a year. It's because he had such an amazing year last year, and they're like, oh, here it comes, Josh Allen. He's going to fall off. And I had just traded for him after week 2, and I was like, there's no way. I was like, this guy, I need this guy. I was never really worried about it. Like, I had a feeling he was going to figure it out. And against Washington, which, like you said, really solid defense coming into the year. Not as good as we thought they were going to be, but really solid.
The goal with him is if you get a rushing touchdown off of him, you go absurd. Because if you watch the Bills, when they're in the short red zone game, he somehow finds his way in there. And it's just a unique offense. I like watching it. But when he gets his 3 to 4 throwing and then adds on a rushing, of course it's amazing. But that's his capability. So he throws for big yards.
So I was like paying close attention to him because I needed to win in that league. And I was like, he had like 43 points or something. I was like, hell yeah, I'm killing it. And then he rushed in another touchdown when they were already up. And I was like, yes, keep doing that all year. I love it. You have some thoughts on the Bears as well, Justin. Why don't you let us know about that?
I didn't get to watch the whole game. I saw some highlights, lack thereof, and I followed up on like the overall outcome. And I don't think in my lifetime I've ever seen such a worse offensive display that team went through. I don't even know what was the crazy stat. Like with total yards minus the penalties, they netted like 3 offensive yards overall or something. Don't quote me, but it was disgustingly low. So the question is, okay, no, the QBs you're not touching, the tight ends you're not touching, no wide receiver aside from A-Rob will you even consider, and David Montgomery might be in jeopardy because that team is so slouched over. So my question is to you, is anybody, A-Rob, Montgomery, worth starting at this point, or do you have to flex them out for someone who might be doing a little bit better overall?
It just really depends. Like, I think every team who has A-Rob is in a unique situation. I have him in one league, and I don't know what happened with this team, but my wide receivers are Allen Robinson, Julio Jones, Brandon Ayuk, right? Those are my top 3 wide receivers. And that hasn't been great so far, right? So I might be out Julio. I have to start Ayuk and I have to start Robinson. But there are teams, like imagine the team who took Robinson, right, as a wide receiver 1, and they have Cooper Kupp and they drafted Jamar Chase, right? And you only starting 2 wide receivers. You're definitely starting Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase over him, right? So it just depends on the situation. But the fact that we even have to have that conversation, you would never, if I told you in the preseason, we're going to go in, I'm starting Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase over Allen Robinson, you'd be like, what are you talking about? But that's a reality now. So that's crazy.
And it's no slight on A-Rob.
No, not at all.
I've never seen a wide receiver get stuck with such trash quarterback play day after day, year after year. Like, give him Mahomes or something. Give him someone that can give him good looks. And
well, look, he's on the franchise tag. Justin Fields could get it together. Obviously, we shouldn't give up on him yet, but if he gets it together, maybe things are different. But Allen Robinson's on the franchise tag. If they don't franchise tag him again, he can sign with another team. So maybe he's playing with a better quarterback next year. Maybe him and Aaron Rodgers go team up somewhere. Who knows?
Ooh, that'd be nice. And it's no slight on Fields. He's a rookie. I know the game's
protect him. There's people that are like, he's a bust. Like, what? No. They gave Tua like a year and a half to to be a bust. give Fields some more time.
Yeah. But
So yeah,
what
any more
about
thoughts on
you?
that?
No,
Oh
no,
yeah,
no.
I had a couple things. So one thing is that first 2 weeks, right? On a different teams, I have Hawkinson, I have Lamb, I have Chubb, players like that, right? Guys, we expect to be really good in fantasy and they perform, but then they all kind of disappoint in week 3. And even losing you matchups, like I just needed like 11 points from CD Lamb to win this week, and I didn't get it. So, and that hurt so bad because he starts off the game so well, and then he couldn't get me 11 points. So, I just want people to keep in mind, be prepared for your big hitters to disappoint sometimes. They're not always going to go off. So, when you're looking at your lineup and you're preparing for your matchup, you have to think, okay, yes, I have these solid guys. I'm still starting these guys no matter what. But what can I do in my lineup to offset if they don't perform? Like, am I going to play a guy who has a safe floor in my flex, or maybe a guy who has a super high ceiling this week in my flex? So I think that you just got to prepare, and at the very least, at least be mentally prepared that you're going to come off some weeks where Chubb doesn't do much for you, where Hawkinson has a 1 point game. So I just think that's something for fantasy managers to keep in mind. Did you experience any of that this week? Any guys you that really disappointed you that are super consistent normally?
Yeah, I thought the Dallas game was interesting because you brought up CD, and I have the other side of Amari Cooper.
Yeah.
And it's not like Dallas didn't do well. It was just a very odd way they scored their points this game. Zeke had a very nice game, so I think that's just part of fantasy football. You can't hit every week, and you just want that
Mm-hmm.
steady average. But Hill didn't have a good week again, but we know he's like a different world where he just pops and then he just goes quiet for a week or two. But uh, yeah, play the
That's a
odds, go
good
with
point,
average.
Tyreek Hill too.
Yeah, it's
And
hard to stay consistent, but if you have a guy like Hawkinson and you think that you should pivot, you're playing this game wrong. I'll tell you that.
exactly, and that's a great point that I wanted to tie into this is never trade these guys coming off these games. Don't ever do it because you're selling low if you do that. If I trade CD Lamb today, I'm selling him based off this last game, not the first 2 weeks, you know? So never sell these guys. I mean, I won't say never because there could be trade scenarios that you're like, okay, I'll do that. But in general, don't go looking to trade these guys after a bad game. Like if anything, trade them after a big game. Another thing I realized, and this is more for super flex leagues, but I do think, and I'm going to be, talking about this a lot in the next like couple years, but I just think that I think fantasy football is headed towards super flex. I think just how PPR became the norm, I think super flex is going to become the norm. And so I think talking about super flex here and there is okay, even though most people don't play in it right now. But I will say, it's really hard to get by in a super flex when your second quarterback is not reliable because it can lose you a matchup. A lot of times, I don't know about you, Justin, but I lose a lot of my matchups by 10 to 15 points or even less sometimes, 10 points or less. And when I have Jimmy Garoppolo in my second quarterback spot, and he gives me 15 points, and then I lose by 7, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's other guys I could have started, or I lose by 3. I could have started Jacoby Brissett instead, picked him off the waiver wire, and it's just tough. So I think, look, there's a lot of superflex teams where maybe your bench you have a couple, good running backs or wide receivers on your bench, or maybe you can sacrifice one of your flexes to upgrade at quarterback. I'm starting to change I used to think, oh, if I have one stud, it doesn't matter who my second quarterback is. I'm starting to go against that because experiencing it with starting Jimmy Garoppolo and then in another Superflex league, like having Sam Darnold be my second quarterback and be very impressive this year, I'm realizing that second quarterback spot matters because you have people in your league who literally have Patrick Mahomes and Kyler Murray as their 2 quarterbacks. So you can't keep up with those teams if you have these bottom of the barrel quarterback 2s, Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first year I've ever had experience with Superflex,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because when Winston got the starter role, I was like, I'm pretty happy about that. And week 1, he went bonkers, and then the last 2 weeks, it's just underwhelming. And I legit lose partially because of that. So it's hard because we know with quarterbacks, after you break like the midway point, there's a huge fall off of skill and fantasy related skill to that. So yeah, I don't know if Superflex is going to take over as a standard because uh, in essence, it would be like making you start three running backs. There's just not enough. And I think if you go super flex, it takes away the fun of like I don't like to have to start bad people. So if I consistently have to start bad people and get scores that relate to that, it will make me lose interest. So I gotta have some fantasy skill and fun at the same time, you know. So that's why I'm hesitant on it becoming the norm, but I think it's a fun twist.
Yeah, I just think, and this is a longer conversation, but I think the more, because if we stick with one quarterbacks, right, we're only ever going to start 10 or 12 quarterbacks in the league, and it limits the ability to, because like I want as much players to be relevant as possible. So if we're literally adding like another dozen of fantasy relevant players into the mix when we play Superflex, and it makes it more fun. I want guys like Ryan Fitzpatrick and guys like that to be able to be startable, and I just think it makes it more fun because now we're looking at uh 10 to 12 other quarterbacks that are fantasy relevant. So I just think that makes the game more fun. But another thing that you and I were talking about at the top before we started was running backs. And look, the running backs are tricky. They're tricky every year. We learn new stuff every year about how to go about them. But I was telling you, Justin, and I wanted to say this for the podcast, that you've always been the guy who said that you typically have drafted wide receivers high. Like you get your running backs at the top, you make sure you get your 2 or 3 running backs that you need, and then you kind of build your team where while everybody else is drafting running backs in the middle of the rounds, you're taking wide receivers and you're getting these guys who are wide receiver ones on their team and potential third or wide high and wide receiver twos, whatever, in fantasy. And I just think, like, yes, running back is more valuable because there's less of them that are fantasy usable, right? Because every team, not even every NFL team, has a usable fantasy running back. And then if you take, like, there's probably maybe 25 that you feel decent about starting, and then there's like 40 wide receivers that you feel decent about starting. So my point is, I think, yeah, you can draft that third or fourth running back and start them, but are they really more relevant than a wide receiver 2 that can get you more points? So I'm starting to change my tune on that a little bit. I used to go, oh, I'm going to go 4 running backs to start the draft, and I did that last year in our redraft league, and it didn't really work out for me. I struggled I barely made the playoffs. I struggled a lot, and I've seen your teams before have 4 wide receivers, 2 in the wide receiver spot, 2 flex, and you usually do really well. So I just think that's something that I'm kind of learning too, is that the running back position is scarce, but you're only maybe starting 20 to 25 guys that you feel really good about. So if you throw 2 in your running back spot and then start 2 wide receivers, especially in PPR, I think that sets you up better to win as opposed to 4 running backs, unless you have crazy value.
Yeah, I agree, and it's been my strategy. And ironically, this year I started running backs in my flex. Like I put Chase Edmonds and Miles Sanders over some mid-tier wide receivers. Sometimes it's worked out. I just find like from a statistical point of view, the variable difference between a mid-tier running back and a mid-tier wide receiver, it's safer to go with the wide receiver and their upside thereof. Because what's easier? They're both very hard. What's easier? A 50-yard breakout for a wide receiver or a running back? I would say it errs more on the wide receiver. So if I can get that 50-yard touchdown out of a flex wide receiver more weeks than I do a running back, then I'm statistically going to have a higher capability of scoring more points. So this week, I'm pivoting. I'm benching Miles Sanders. I'm starting Jamar Chase. I might bench. Actually, I'm going to keep Edmonds in because I'm weak on the bench on that league. But to put in perspective, it also hinders your bench, your roster, because this year I wasn't as prepared as I like to be, so I wanted to take some shots. Some of those shots missed, and now I'm sitting on those running backs that you can't drop but you don't want to play. So it tied my roster up. So with wide receivers, it's somehow like you feel better dropping them than you do any running back, because an injury with running backs goes from you can't play him to a must start number one waiver wire trade bait, and it's just such an hard
That's a good
dynamic.
point because every time I'm thinking about a player to drop, I'm always dropping a wide receiver before I drop a running back because there's more on the waiver wire though.
Yeah,
Like there's always like 10 guys on the waiver wire you can pick up and start if you had to for wide receiver. And there's literally like there's 0 guys on running back that you can pick up and start on the waiver wire.
I know it's crazy to me. Like I see everyone's like, go get Chuba, go get Chuba. I'm like, why wasn't he rostered already? What kind of
No,
league
he
are you
should have
playing
like
in?
who didn't already roster him, because even if the CMC manager didn't roster him, somebody else should have, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. That's why I'm like, I look at mine and I'm just thinking, wow, I'm getting third stringers right now. There's nothing to get.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
Exactly.